Have you ever given years of your life to a company only to be erased the moment you became inconvenient? Have you ever felt the sting of betrayal so sharp that it almost silenced you, yet deep down you knew the silence would become your strength? Imagine being fired right before a $280 million merger, told you were nothing, erased from the very systems you built with your own hands. Would you accept it quietly, or would you wait, watch, and take back everything they thought they stole? I want to share my story with you. Not just of anger and betrayal, but of patience, strategy, and a victory that no one saw coming. Now I ask you to take a few minutes, lean in, and listen to my confidences. My name is Hannah Blake. I am 37 years old. I was born and raised in Columbus, Ohio, and I work as a software architect specializing in systems infrastructure. For the past 7 years, I built my career in Boston, working for a technology company called BrightLink Systems. I had always believed that if you gave your very best, the company would value your loyalty. I believed that long nights at the office, canceled holidays, and endless problem-solving would eventually be rewarded. What I did not realize then was that loyalty in the corporate world is often a one-way street. The day it all began, I walked into the office expecting a routine meeting about system performance. Instead, I was called into a glass-walled conference room where the CEO, Michael Trent, 42 years old, sat with a folder already open on the table. He told me in the smooth tone of someone who had practiced the words 100 times, "Hannah, your role here has come to an end." There was no thank you, no recognition of the years of work I had poured into the platform, only a forced smile and a stack of papers sliding across the table like a sentence. I remember staring at the words, "termination effective immediately," as if they were written in another language. 7 years reduced to a line of cold text. What made it worse was the timing. I had just finished leading the rebuild of a critical analytics pipeline that carried the weight of nearly every client report. I knew why they pushed me out. They were preparing for a merger worth $280 million, and they thought removing me would make the paperwork cleaner. They wanted my silence more than my service. 3 days later, a courier delivered a heavy envelope to my apartment. Inside was the official termination letter, a non-disclosure agreement, and a non-compete clause so aggressive it felt like they had planned it months in advance. It said I could not work for any competitor, could not advise, could not consult, and could not even contribute to any product remotely similar for 1 full year. It was written like they wanted to bury me. They even claimed I was ineligible for unemployment benefits, accusing me of misconduct that never happened. I sat alone in my apartment that night with the envelope spread out across the table. I felt anger rising in me like a tide. I thought about the years of architecture diagrams, the countless midnight deployments, and the holidays I had worked while Michael posted photos of his vacations online. I thought about how they had erased my name from the credits of the very system I had designed. That was the moment resentment turned into resolve. I whispered to myself, if they think they buried me, they're about to learn I was planning my escape long before they pushed me out. When the anger finally settled into my chest, I began to read every line of the documents they had sent me. I am not a lawyer, but years of technical writing had trained me to see patterns and to notice when something did not align. The termination letter was predictable, full of corporate phrases about performance issues and alignment with business goals. The non-disclosure agreement was thick with restrictions, warning me not to speak to anyone about projects, clients, or even former coworkers. But it was the non-compete clause that nearly made me laugh. It was written as if they believed I could never escape its reach, but I knew better. The non-compete outlined page after page of restrictions. It said I could not take employment with any company even remotely connected to software analytics. It said I could not contract independently, could not consult, and could not even volunteer for projects if they mirrored anything Brightlink considered competitive. The language was venomous, every sentence designed to tie my hands behind my back. Reading it, I could feel their fear. This was not protection. This was punishment. They wanted me erased, forgotten, invisible. It was as though they thought their paperwork could undo 7 years of architecture meetings and deployments that bore my fingerprints. I poured myself a glass of water and stared at the table where the documents lay. In the silence, I could almost hear Michael's voice, smooth and dismissive, telling me I had been overestimating my importance. That sentence had cut deep when he said it during a disagreement months earlier. He had no idea that I had been keeping careful notes of my own. Not company files, but personal records. Snapshots of my work before I even joined Brightlink. I had a habit of keeping backups, drawings, and prototype code on a battered silver USB drive. In black marker, I had once labeled it in all caps, Athena V3. To them it was nothing, but to me it was proof of authorship. I walked to my bookshelf and pulled down a small box hidden behind old paperbacks. Inside was the USB drive, scratched, faded, but intact. I held it in my hand like a coin for the ferryman, something you keep close when you know a journey is coming. I had never planned on using it against anyone, but I knew from the day I joined Brightlink that one should always have a safeguard. In technology, there are two kinds of people, the ones who plan for the next 2 weeks, and the ones who plan for the next 2 years. They had mistaken me for the first kind, and that was their mistake. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the drive beside me and the documents spread out in front of me. I thought about the merger they were preparing, the investors already circling, the press releases waiting for approval. They believed they had silenced me with a signature. What they did not know was that their silence had given me time. Time to think, time to plan, and time to decide how I would respond. As I looked at the Sharpie letters spelling Athena V3, I felt my resentment harden into determination. I whispered to the empty room, "You wanted me gone, but you are going to remember my name when it matters most." A week after I received the papers, I found myself walking into a modest law office on the east side of Boston. It was not one of those glossy firms with glass walls and espresso machines in the lobby. The sign on the door was plain, almost forgettable, but the receptionist greeted me with a warmth I had not felt in weeks. Her calm voice steadied me as she said, "Mr. Porter will see you now." I stepped inside and there he was, Daniel Porter, 55 years old, with salt and pepper hair, a weathered face, and the kind of presence that made you believe he had seen every corporate trick in the book. He shook my hand firmly and asked me to sit while he flipped through the stack of papers I had carried in with me. For 15 minutes he said almost nothing. His brow furrowed, his fingers tapped the edges of the documents, and once or twice he let out a low grunt, the sound of someone recognizing a pattern of cruelty they had seen before. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and removed his glasses. He looked at me with a small nod and said, "They are scared of you, Hannah. That is what this is. I have seen this exact play before. Overwritten clauses, exaggerated restrictions, the kind of contract written by people who want to make sure you never get up again. This is not protection. This is fear." His words landed like a spark in dry grass. I asked him what it meant, whether I had any chance of working again without being dragged into court. He tapped the thick non-compete agreement with his pen and shook his head slowly. "As of today, this would hold up," he admitted. "A judge would likely side with them if you tried to build anything similar right now. They can argue that you had access to trade secrets and strategic data. They would frame you as a threat, and it would be a messy fight. My chest tightened. I felt the bitterness rising again, the thought that they had planned this to trap me. But then his tone changed, and he leaned forward with a faint smile. However, the law is changing. A bill just passed last quarter. It goes into effect January 2nd. And once it does, these types of non-compete agreements will no longer be enforceable for software professionals. When that day comes, they cannot touch you. The air in the room seemed to shift. I repeated his words to make sure I had heard correctly. So if I wait, they lose their grip? He nodded, calm and confident. That is exactly right. No paper trail, no leaks, no violations in the meantime. You must keep your head down and let the clock run. But when the calendar turns, you will be free, and they will have nothing to stand on. For the first time since my firing, I felt something other than resentment. I felt clarity. I thanked him and gathered the papers into my bag. As I walked out of the office, the cold Boston air hit my face and I closed my eyes for a moment. All I had to do was wait, but I would not wait idly. They thought they had buried me. In truth, they had only given me time to sharpen my resolve. I whispered to myself as I tightened my coat against the wind. They built a prison for me, but they forgot that walls crumble when the foundation is weak. And I know exactly where the cracks are. The night after I met with Daniel Porter, I sat alone at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold beside me. His words kept repeating in my head like a mantra. January 2nd. That was the finish line. All I had to do was endure the silence until then. But I knew myself well enough to understand I could not simply sit still. If I stayed frozen, my mind would devour me. I needed to act, but act carefully, quietly, and without leaving a trace. I turned on my personal laptop, the same scratched Lenovo that had followed me through grad school, and began the process of erasing myself from the digital map that Brightlink controlled. The first thing I deleted was my LinkedIn profile. Years of carefully built endorsements, connections, and polite summaries about leadership vanished in the space of a password and a click. I did not want recruiters circling with empty promises, and I did not want Brightlink's board to see me as desperate. I wanted to disappear. Next, I scrubbed my GitHub repositories. Every project that could be traced back to me went private. I even blanked my profile photo and bio, leaving behind nothing but an empty shell. When I was finished, it was as if Hannah Blake had simply stepped out of the room and never returned. My phone buzzed with texts from colleagues who had noticed the sudden void. I did not answer. Silence was safer than any explanation I could give. But I was not erasing myself out of defeat. I was clearing the ground to build again. Only this time, I would not be Hannah Blake, the loyal employee who carried Brightlink systems on her back. I would be someone else. I opened a new document and typed a name that I had once used in college when I wanted privacy online. Mara Lowell. Mara was a shadow, an alias without history or baggage. Under that name, I registered a limited liability company in a neighboring state. The paperwork was dull, almost boring, but it gave me something invaluable. Legal protection and a clean slate. No one would connect Mara Lowell to the woman Brightlink had tried to bury. The days that followed were strange. By day, I kept to myself, ignoring the ache of betrayal and the sting of being forgotten. By night, I planned. I mapped out a system architecture on legal pads and in notebooks, sketching the kind of platform I had always wanted to build, one unchained from politics and short-sighted executives. I was not copying what Brightlink had done. I was designing what they should have built in the first place. The vision was clear, elegant, and lean, like a song I had been humming for years but had never been allowed to play. One evening, as snow fell outside my apartment window, I slid the silver USB drive labeled Athena V3 back into its hiding place. I realized I did not need to plug it in yet. The real blueprints were already in my head, sharpened by every mistake Brightlink had made and every warning they had ignored. They thought I was silent. They thought I was finished. But under the name Mara Lowell, in the quiet of winter nights, I had already started building the foundation of their replacement. The first few weeks working under the name Mara Lowell were lonely but focused. I spent hours hunched over my desk, sketching architectures on notebook paper and writing fragments of code in quiet test environments. But I knew I could not do this alone. Building a platform capable of challenging Brightlink required more than one set of hands. It required trust, and trust was rare after what I had endured. Still, there were two people whose names I could not forget. Two people who had once proven their loyalty when everyone else was chasing titles and promotions. The first was Rachel Kim, 29 years old, a gifted front-end developer I had mentored when she first joined Brightlink as an intern. Rachel had an instinct for user experience that could not be taught. She had once redesigned a reporting dashboard in a weekend after executives spent months arguing about fonts and colors. I remembered the way her eyes had lit up when I told her she had talent worth protecting. The second was Marcus Hill, 33 years old, a back-end engineer with the mind of a chess player. Marcus could see 3 steps ahead in code, predicting problems before they even appeared in production. We had worked late nights together, debugging legacy systems that everyone else had abandoned. I trusted him because he never asked for credit. He only asked for clarity. I reached out to both of them in silence. No phone calls, no emails, just carefully worded encrypted messages sent through channels Brightlink would never monitor. At first, Rachel thought it was a prank. When I told her who I was and why I had vanished, she sent back a single reply. "Where do I sign?" Marcus responded within an hour with 2 words. "I'm in." They did not ask for salaries or guarantees. They did not ask for details about revenge or risk. They only asked for the chance to build something better, something real. We set rules from the beginning. No real names in the code. No references to Brightlink. No social media. Every commit was routed through layered networks and stripped of fingerprints. We were not stealing. We were not copying. We were rebuilding from scratch, but with sharper vision. Where Brightlink had been bloated with features nobody used, our system would be lean and modular. Where their pipelines sagged under outdated dependencies, ours would glide with precision. Every night we pushed code into encrypted containers. Every morning we reviewed changes on a bare-bones dashboard hosted on a server no one else would ever think to look for. There were nights when exhaustion pressed heavy on my shoulders, when I wondered if the risk was too great. But then I remembered the smirk on Michael Trent's face as he told me I was no longer needed. I remembered the sting of being erased from the very systems I had built. That memory was fuel. Together, the 3 of us were not just writing code. We were crafting a weapon. A platform that would stand in the shadows, waiting until the day came when Brightlink would realize the ghost they had tried to bury was still very much alive. By late autumn, the 3 of us had been working in silence for nearly 2 months. Nights blurred into mornings as code piled higher and higher, yet none of us complained. Every line we wrote carried purpose. Every diagram Rachel sketched gave clarity. Every server Marcus spun up added stability. We called the project Navara, a name whispered in the shadows of our encrypted channels. It did not need a website or a press release. It only needed to exist, to breathe, and it did. But secrets have a way of finding cracks, and soon whispers began to ripple through corners of the industry. At first, it was just a single forum post, nothing more than a question. Has anyone heard of a platform called Navarra? The thread was short, but the responses were curious. Some dismissed it as rumor, others swore they had seen early test builds floating around. A week later, a procurement manager mentioned the name during a vendor call with Brightlink. He asked casually whether they had looked at Navarra's approach to system redundancy. The silence on Brightlink's end was telling. They brushed it off, but I knew that somewhere in their office, Michael Trent had already heard the name. Meanwhile, Brightlink was stumbling under the weight of its own neglect. Outages spiked during peak hours, customer support tickets doubled, and a Fortune 500 client quietly threatened to cancel. Rachel forwarded me screenshots from private forums where clients were comparing experiences. One user wrote, "Our dashboards crash every Monday morning, but I heard Navarra is building something smoother." Another posted, "If Navarra launches, Brightlink is finished." I read those words in the dim light of my apartment and felt something dangerous stirring inside me. It was not joy exactly. It was vindication. Then came the article. No one claimed it, but it appeared on a respected tech blog under the title, "The Bridge to Nowhere." It was ruthless in its precision, dissecting Brightlink architecture like a surgeon exposing a failing heart. It outlined dependencies left untouched since 2019, caching errors that silently corrupted data, and even referenced an internal nickname. Falcon Bridge, that only a handful of us had ever used. Whoever wrote it had knowledge too close to ignore. The article spread like wildfire. Investors noticed, clients panicked, and engineers inside Brightlink whispered questions no one dared answer aloud. When I read the article on my laptop, I did not smile. I simply closed my eyes and listened to the hum of my heater filling the silence. I had not written it, but I knew the truth it carried. Brightlink was rotting from the inside, and Navarra was a shadow looming just out of sight. That was the moment I understood something important. I did not need to shout. I did not need to prove myself to anyone. All I needed to do was keep building and let their fear grow in the spaces where my name used to be. The ghost they erased was already haunting them. As winter pressed in and the nights grew long, I kept waiting for the moment Brightlink would call my bluff. But the truth was, they did not even know where to look. Navarra was still invisible, a shadow moving beneath their feet. Every morning, Rachel sent me refinements for the front end that looked like they belonged in the future rather than the present. Marcus delivered back-end improvements so smooth it felt like the system was gliding on rails. And every night before I shut my laptop, I stared at the silver USB drive marked Athena v3 and reminded myself that patience was my greatest weapon. Then came the call that changed everything. It was close to midnight, and I was sitting in a quiet bar nursing a glass of bourbon that tasted more like wood glue than comfort. My phone buzzed with an unknown number. For a second I thought about ignoring it, but something in my gut told me to answer. The voice on the other end was familiar, a contact I had not spoken to in months, someone with a close eye on state politics. He did not waste time. It passed. Hannah. 37-11. The governor is signing it this week. I felt my breath catch. You mean the labor bill? He chuckled softly. Exactly. Starting January 2nd, non-competes for software professionals are void. You are in the clear. The noise of the bar faded into silence around me. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear and whispered, "You knew I was waiting for this." He replied with a dry laugh. I figured, and now they are the ones who should be worried. When the call ended, I set my phone face down on the table and watched the condensation fog the window beside me. Snow was beginning to fall in thick, lazy flakes. I realized my hands were steady for the first time in months. I was free. All I had to do was wait a few more weeks and keep everything under wraps. Meanwhile, Brightlink was unraveling faster than I could have predicted. Clients were walking away, engineers were burning out, and whispers of Navarra were spreading into Slack threads and private Discord groups. I heard from an old friend still inside that Michael Trent had started holding daily war room meetings, trying to force his team to patch systems that were already collapsing. He called it a strategic rewrite, but everyone knew it was desperation. They were duct taping holes in a sinking ship while I was quietly building a vessel designed to fly. I walked home through the falling snow that night with my coat pulled tight and my thoughts sharp as glass. A year ago, they had pushed me out like I was disposable. Now, as the law shifted and their foundation crumbled, I held all the leverage they thought they had taken from me. I whispered into the winter air, "You wanted me silent. You are about to hear me louder than ever." The weeks leading up to January felt like standing on the edge of a storm. Brightlink kept stumbling, pretending everything was fine, while I sat quietly with a weapon they had no idea existed. For years I had warned them about licensing issues, about modules that had slipped into production without the right attribution. They had brushed me off with condescending smiles and phrases like, "You overestimate your importance, Hannah." What they never realized was that one of the libraries sitting at the heart of their flagship product had been mine all along, written and registered under my name months before I ever signed a contract with them. They had taken it, built around it, and ignored me when I raised the red flag. That oversight was about to become their undoing. I met with Daniel Porter again, sliding the silver USB drive across his desk like it was evidence in a criminal case. He plugged it in and reviewed the old commit logs, the timestamps, the documentation that all carried my initials. After half an hour, he leaned back, tapping his pen against the arm of his chair. "This is airtight," he said. "This code predates your employment. They cannot claim ownership. If anything, they owe you licensing fees for every single use since the day it went live." I watched his words hang in the air like a verdict already passed. "Are you ready to use it?" he asked. My answer was simple. "Yes, it is time." Together we drafted the cease and desist letter. It was calm, professional, and brutal in its precision. The opening lines laid out the facts: unauthorized use of my intellectual property, timestamps proving authorship prior to my employment, and continued reliance on that library within Brightlink's current system. The letter demanded an immediate halt to their use or the establishment of a retroactive licensing agreement. No bluster, no insults, just law and proof. When I signed my name at the bottom, my hand did not shake. For the first time since my firing, I felt steady. I imagined Michael Trent receiving the letter, laughing at first, dismissing it the way he always dismissed anything that challenged his ego. But laughter would not carry him far. Once his legal team opened the documents and traced the commit IDs, the smirk would vanish. They would realize that the product they were about to sell for $280 million had been built on a foundation they did not own. The foundation belonged to me. Without my signature, their empire was nothing but sand. That night, I walked home through the cold streets of Boston with the winter wind biting my face. I felt no guilt, no hesitation. They had written me out of my own story, tried to erase my name from history, and thought I would vanish quietly. Instead, I had given them silence long enough for the law to turn in my favor. Now it was my move. As I unlocked my apartment door, I whispered to myself, "You should have listened when I warned you. Now you will pay to use the code you tried to steal." The courthouse smelled faintly of coffee and printer toner, the kind of stale air that clings to government buildings where lives are decided in small, windowless rooms. On December 18th, I walked through the heavy doors wearing a charcoal blazer, my hair tied back, and no jewelry. I wanted no distractions, no symbols, only focus. At the plaintiff's table, I laid out my notes with calm precision. Across from me, Michael Trent sat beside his attorney, his tie pulled too tight, his jaw clenched. He glanced at me once, and in that single look I saw the flicker of doubt behind his eyes. He tried to mask it with a smirk, but I knew the man well enough to recognize fear when it crept into his posture. His attorney, a polished man in his 50s with perfect gray hair, rose first. His voice carried the confidence of someone who had spent his entire career steamrolling opponents with paperwork. He spoke of my termination, my signed non-compete, and accused me of launching a rival product in direct violation. He requested an injunction to halt Navarra immediately, demanding disclosure of collaborators and funding sources. His tone suggested the case was already won. I kept my eyes fixed ahead, expression still, my hands folded neatly on the table. When he finished, my attorney, Daniel Porter, rose slowly. He did not raise his voice. He did not grandstand. He simply walked to the bench, handed the judge a single highlighted page, and said, "Your Honor, as of January 2nd of this year, non-compete clauses for software professionals are deemed void under State Labor Code Amendment 74B. This agreement is unenforceable." The courtroom stilled as the judge adjusted his glasses and read the line aloud. A contractual provision that restricts a software professional from employment in a similar industry shall be considered void as against public policy. The words echoed like a hammer striking steel. Michael's attorney leaned forward, reading again, slower this time, as the certainty drained from his face. He turned to his client, whispering urgently. Michael's smirk faltered. He shifted in his chair, his knee bouncing against the floor. I did not move. I did not smile. Silence was my answer. The judge looked up and said plainly, "Unless the defense can present a compelling argument that this law does not apply, the plaintiff was never in breach." Daniel nodded once. "Correct, Your Honor. For the first time in a year, I breathed without the weight of fear pressing against my chest." Michael leaned closer to his lawyer, his voice caught by the court microphone. "What is happening?" he hissed. His attorney's reply was low and bitter. She knew. She knew the law would flip the whole time. I felt the corners of my lips tighten, not into a smile, but into the calm satisfaction of a storm finally breaking. They had built their case on sand. And in that room, under buzzing fluorescent lights, the tide swept it away. The ruling came on a Thursday morning, ordinary in every way except for the single sentence that changed everything. The judge's voice was calm, even, and final as he declared that I retained ownership of my original intellectual property and that Brightlink Systems must obtain a licensing agreement for continued use, effective retroactively. His gavel came down with a hollow crack that echoed through the courtroom, and just like that, the ground shifted beneath Michael Trent's empire. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then I saw it. The look in his eyes as the realization sank in. His jaw slackened, his shoulders slumped, and the smug confidence he had carried into this battle collapsed in on itself. The $280 million merger he had been parading to investors was over before it began. News spread faster than I expected. Within hours, headlines rolled across industry feeds. Engineer wins landmark IP case. Brightlink merger in jeopardy. Non-compete struck down by new law. I watched the words scroll across my phone screen while sitting in a quiet cafe, my coffee cooling in my hand. By the end of the week, investors had pulled out, the merger talks froze, and procurement teams began reevaluating contracts. The castle Michael had built on arrogance and borrowed code crumbled like wet sand, and all I had done was stand my ground. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to exhale fully. When the licensing agreement was finalized, I signed it with a steady hand. Brightlink would continue to use the module at the heart of their system, but now they would pay me monthly royalties indexed to usage. Every report they generated, every client dashboard they processed, every breath their platform took, they would owe me. It was not revenge in the form of fire and ruin. It was something quieter, sharper, and far more permanent. They would survive, but on my terms, and every day that passed would remind them of the woman they had tried to erase. My new office did not sparkle with luxury. It was modest, a repurposed loft with high windows and the faint smell of new paint. But it was mine. Rachel sat across the bullpen refining a design mock-up, her laughter filling the room. Marcus leaned over a terminal, absorbed in optimizing the back end that purred like a well-oiled machine. They did not need constant check-ins or endless meetings. They simply worked because they believed in what we were building. On my desk, polished walnuts smoothed by hand, rested the old silver USB drive labeled Athena V3. I picked it up and turned it over in my fingers. I had never plugged it in once. I did not need to. Because the real safeguard was never the files on the drive. It was me. As the evening sun poured golden light across the floor, I stepped out onto the balcony and looked down at the city below. The wind tugged at my hair, and for the first time in a long while, I felt no resentment, no fear, only freedom. They had tried to bury me in silence, but silence had become my strength. My victory was not loud. It was measured in ownership, in independence, and in the steady hum of Navarra growing stronger every day. They had wanted me forgotten. Instead, they paid for the privilege of remembering me forever. When I look back, I realize the lesson was never about revenge alone. It was about knowing your worth when others try to bury it, about understanding that patience can be sharper than anger, and about turning silence into power. They thought they had taken my future, but instead they built the stage for my freedom. What do you think? Should betrayal always be answered with fire, or is the sweetest justice the kind that forces them to pay for every single day they try to erase you? Share your thoughts in the comments, because stories like this matter, and your perspective might help someone else who is fighting their own battle. And remember, every setback can be the beginning of a strategy that leads to triumph.